In the grand halls of Versailles, where whispers carried more weight than gold and a single glance could topple kingdoms, one ordinary palace guard was about to stumble upon a secret so dangerous that it would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy. What he discovered in those fateful 5 minutes would not only change his life forever, but expose a web of deception that had been carefully woven around King Louis for decades.
Sometimes the most earth-shattering revelations come not from spies or nobles, but from the most unexpected sources, a simple guard doing his nightly rounds. The autumn rain pelted against the towering windows of Versailles as Captain Henri Dubois made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the East Wing.
It was well past midnight, and the palace had settled into its usual nocturnal rhythm, a deceptive quiet that masked the countless secrets lurking behind every gilded door. Henri had walked these halls for nearly 15 years, his footsteps as familiar to the marble floors as the tick of the great clock in the Hall of Mirrors. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on his neck stand on end.
At 42 years old, Henri was no longer the young, ambitious guard who had arrived at Versailles with dreams of glory and recognition. Time had weathered his face and bent his shoulders slightly, but his eyes remained sharp, alert to every detail that others might miss.
His colleagues often joked that Henri could hear a pin drop in the next province, and tonight, that heightened awareness would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. The East Wing housed some of the most important chambers in the palace, the private apartments of high-ranking nobles, the treasury offices, and most significantly, the king's private study where Louis conducted his most confidential business.
Henri's route took him past these rooms every 2 hours, a schedule that had become as natural to him as breathing. But as he approached the familiar ornate door of the king's study, he noticed something that made him pause mid-step. A thin sliver of light escaped from beneath the heavy oak door, unusual for this time of night. The king typically retired hours ago, and his study was always secured and darkened by 10 in the evening. Henri's training kicked in immediately. Any deviation from the normal routine required investigation, no matter how minor it might seem. He had seen too many small oversights lead to major security breaches to ignore even the smallest detail. Moving closer to the door, Henri could hear the low murmur of voices from within. His pulse quickened. The king was supposed to be in his chambers, and no meetings were scheduled for this hour. Protocol demanded that Henri be informed of any late-night activities in the secure areas of the palace. The fact that he had received no such notifications sent alarm bells ringing through his mind. Henri pressed his ear gently against the cool wood of the door, straining to make out the conversation within. The voices were indeed coming from inside the study, but something about their tone made his blood run cold. There was an urgency, almost a desperation in the whispered exchanges that suggested this was no ordinary late-night discussion about state affairs. The documents must be destroyed before dawn, came a voice that Henri recognized immediately. It belonged to the king's most trusted advisor, Minister François de Montclair, the man who had served the crown faithfully for over 2 decades, whose loyalty had never been questioned, whose counsel the king valued above all others. "But your majesty, if we proceed with this plan, there will be no turning back," came another voice, this one belonging to someone Henri couldn't immediately identify. "The consequences could be catastrophic if we're discovered." Henri's breath caught in his throat. The conversation was clearly about something far more serious than routine palace business. The mention of destroying documents, combined with the secretive hour and the tone of desperate urgency, suggested something that could potentially threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. "We have no choice," came a third voice, and this time Henri's legs nearly gave out beneath him. It was unmistakably the voice of King Louis himself, but there was something in its timbre that Henri had never heard before. Fear. Raw, undisguised fear that seemed to permeate every word. "The guard's discovery has accelerated our timeline. We cannot afford to wait any longer." The guard's discovery. Henri's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. What guard? What discovery? And more importantly, what were they planning to destroy that was so crucial it required the king's personal attention in the dead of night? Henri knew he was walking a dangerous line. Eavesdropping on the king was not just a breach of protocol. It was treason, punishable by death. But something deep in his gut told him that what he was witnessing was far more significant than a simple breach of etiquette. The fear in the king's voice, the urgency of their discussion, the talk of destruction and consequences. It all pointed to something that could have far-reaching implications for the kingdom. "The treaty with England must never see the light of day," continued the king's voice. "If the people discover what we've agreed to, there will be revolution in the streets. The nobles will turn against us, and everything we've built will crumble." Henri's eyes widened in shock. A secret treaty with England?
France's relationship with its longtime rival had been complex and often hostile. The idea that the king might have entered into a clandestine agreement with the English crown was stunning enough, but the implication that this treaty contained terms so controversial they would spark revolution was beyond Henri's ability to fully comprehend. The financial arrangements alone would be enough to ignite the countryside, came Minister Montclair's voice again. The agreement to allow English merchants exclusive trading rights in our ports, the promise to provide military support for their colonial ventures, the reduction of tariffs that will devastate our own merchants. Any one of these provisions would be political suicide if made public. Henry felt as though the ground beneath his feet was shifting.
The implications of what he was hearing were staggering. Not only had the king apparently made secret agreements with England, but these agreements seemed to favor English interests at the expense of French sovereignty and prosperity. The very idea that Louis would enter into such arrangements was almost incomprehensible. And the territorial concessions? Asked the unknown third voice.
That information dies with us tonight, responded the king firmly. The maps, the surveys, the correspondence, all of it must be reduced to ash before morning. If Parliament discovers that we've agreed to cede parts of Normandy and Brittany to English control in exchange for their support in our war with Spain, we won't live to see another sunset. Territorial concessions? The king had agreed to give away French soil to the English.
The very provinces that had been French for centuries, that had been defended with French blood, were being handed over like pieces in a chess game? The conversation continued for several more minutes, each revelation more shocking than the last.
Henri learned of secret payments to English nobles, of agreements to suppress French merchants who competed too successfully with English trade, of promises to alter French foreign policy to align with English interests. It was a wholesale betrayal of everything Henri had sworn to protect when he took his oath as a palace guard. But perhaps most shocking of all was the casual way in which these men discussed the deception of the French people. They spoke of drafting false documents to cover their tracks, of creating misleading reports to Parliament, of using the palace's intelligence network to suppress any investigation into their activities. The level of premeditation and the scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity. "What of Captain Dubois?" came the unknown voice suddenly, and Henri's heart nearly stopped. They were talking about him. His patrol route brings him past this door regularly. If he becomes suspicious, Henry has been faithful for 15 years. Came Minister Montclair's voice. He follows his orders without question, and doesn't concern himself with matters beyond his station. As long as we maintain normal appearances, he won't be a problem. Henry felt a mixture of relief and bitter irony. His reputation for loyalty and discretion, the very qualities that had earned him his position and the trust of his superiors, were now being counted upon to help cover up what might be the greatest betrayal in French history. Nevertheless, continued the king's voice, we must be more careful. Tonight's work is too important to risk any interruption. Francois, post additional guards at the entrances to this wing. Tell them it's a security drill. They don't need to know the real reason. Henry realized with growing alarm that his window of opportunity to learn more was rapidly closing. If additional guards were posted, his ability to move freely through this area would be severely limited. More importantly, if they suspected that anyone had overheard their conversation, the consequences for that person would be severe indeed. But even as panic began to set in, Henri's mind was working furiously to process and memorize every detail he had heard.
The secret treaty with England, the territorial concessions, the financial arrangements, the plans for deception, each piece of information was potentially explosive. The question that now tormented him was what to do with this knowledge.
As a sworn guardian of the crown, Henri's duty was clear, to protect the king and maintain the security of the realm. But what happened when the king himself was the threat to that security? What did loyalty mean when the monarch was betraying everything that Henri had pledged to defend? The sound of chairs scraping against the floor inside the study snapped Henri back to immediate awareness of his surroundings. The meeting was breaking up and he needed to move quickly to avoid being discovered. But as he began to step away from the door, one final exchange froze him in place. "Remember," came the king's voice, now closer to the door, "if anyone discovers what we've done here tonight, they cannot be allowed to leave this palace alive. The future of the monarchy depends on absolute secrecy. Are we understood?" "Perfectly, Your Majesty," came the unified response from the other two men. Henri's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The casual way in which they discussed murder, the matter-of-fact acceptance of the need to eliminate any witnesses, drove home the true gravity of what he had stumbled upon. These were not simply corrupt officials making underhanded deals. These were desperate men who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As footsteps approached the door from within,
Henri forced himself to move with the silent efficiency that had made him one of the palace's most trusted guards. He slipped away from the door and into a shadowy alcove, just as the first figure emerged from the king's study. Through the darkness, Henri watched as the three conspirators parted ways, each heading in a different direction through the palace corridors. The king himself was the last to leave, and as he passed within mere feet of Henry's hiding place, the guard could see the strain etched deeply into the monarch's features. This was not the confident, regal figure that Henry had served faithfully for so many years. This was a frightened man carrying the weight of terrible secrets, a ruler who had compromised everything he claimed to stand for in pursuit of some greater political goal that Henri could not yet fully understand. As the king's footsteps faded into the distance, Henri emerged from his hiding place with his mind reeling. In the space of less than 30 minutes, everything he thought he knew about his world had been turned upside down. The king he had sworn to protect was engaged in treasonous activities. The minister he had respected was complicit in betraying French interests. And the palace he had called home for 15 years was now the most dangerous place he could possibly be. But Henry Dubois was no ordinary palace guard. 15 years of service had taught him that information was the most valuable currency in Versailles, and he had just acquired information that could reshape the entire kingdom. The question now was not just what to do with this knowledge, but whether he would live long enough to use it. As he resumed his patrol route, moving through the familiar corridors with practiced stealth, Henri began to formulate a plan. The documents they had spoken of destroying, if he could intercept even one of them, he would have proof of everything he had heard. But such an attempt would be incredibly dangerous, and failure would certainly mean death. Yet as Henri considered his options, he realized that doing nothing might be even more dangerous. If the king's secret treaty with England was as devastating to French interests as it appeared, then remaining silent would make him complicit in the betrayal of his own country. The oath he had sworn to protect the realm might actually require him to act against the king himself. The irony was not lost on him. The guard who had been praised for his unwavering loyalty was now contemplating the ultimate act of betrayal. But perhaps, Henri reflected grimly, in a world where the king himself was the traitor, loyalty itself had become a form of treason. As the great clock in the Hall of Mirrors chimed 1 in the morning, Henri Dubois found himself standing at a crossroads that would define not only the rest of his life, but potentially the fate of the entire French kingdom. The next few hours would determine whether he remained a faithful guard following orders, or became something far more dangerous, a man with the power to expose the darkest secrets of the most powerful people in France. The palace around him seemed to pulse with hidden dangers and unspoken threats. But Henry had survived 15 years in this treacherous environment by being smarter, more careful, and more determined than those around him. Now, with the most important test of his life ahead of him, standing in the shadow of a marble pillar in the grand foyer, he watched the last of the palace's late-night visitors depart through the main entrance. The building had settled into its deepest quiet, the time when even the most dedicated servants allowed themselves a few hours of rest. It was now or never. Henri's plan was born from 15 years of intimate knowledge of Versailles and its rhythms. He knew which floors creaked, which doors squeaked, and most importantly, which routes would allow him to move undetected through the palace's maze-like interior. The king's study, where the conspiracy had unfolded just hours earlier, would be his first target. If documents were to be destroyed before dawn, some of them might still be there waiting for collection. The corridors that had seemed so familiar during his regular patrol now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could signal discovery and death. Henri moved with the fluid grace of a man whose life depended on absolute silence, his soft-soled boots making no sound against the polished marble floors. As he approached the east wing, Henry noticed immediately that something had changed since his earlier rounds. Additional guards had indeed been posted, just as the king had ordered. 2 men stood at the main entrance to the wing, their positions chosen to provide maximum visibility of anyone approaching the sensitive areas. Henri recognized both guards. Loyal men who followed orders without question, exactly the type who would carry out a kill order without hesitation if they discovered him in an unauthorized area. But Henry had an advantage that the conspirators couldn't have anticipated. His years of service had taught him about passages and routes that even many longtime palace residents didn't know existed. Versailles had been built and rebuilt over centuries, and each renovation had left behind forgotten corridors, sealed doorways, and service tunnels that a resourceful person could use to move through the building unseen. Henri made his way to a small door hidden behind a tapestry in the servants' quarters.
The door led to a narrow passage that had once been used to allow staff to move between floors without disturbing the nobles in the main corridors. The passage was dark, cramped, and filled with dust that made Henri fight to suppress coughs that would give away his position. But it ran directly behind the east wing, with several access points that would allow him to emerge very close to his target. After what felt like an eternity of careful movement through the narrow space, Henri reached the access point closest to the king's study. He pressed his ear to the thin wooden panel that separated him from the main corridor, and listened intently. The silence was complete. Even the additional guards were far enough away that their presence didn't register through the thick stone walls of the palace. Henri carefully pushed open the panel and slipped into the corridor. The king's study was just 20 feet away, its ornate door standing like a sentinel guarding secrets that could destroy kingdoms. As Henri approached the door, he noticed that it was no longer locked. In their haste to begin their clandestine work, the conspirators had left it unsecured, a mistake that would prove to be their undoing. The study itself was a testament to royal power and taste. Rich burgundy drapes framed tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes reached from floor to ceiling, their gilt lettering catching the faint light from the dying embers in the massive fireplace. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, maps, and documents that represented the administrative machinery of one of Europe's most powerful nations. But it was what Henri saw scattered across a smaller side table that made his breath catch in his throat. Dozens of documents lay in organized piles, clearly prepared for destruction. Even in the dim light, Henri could make out official seals, signatures, and the distinctive watermarks of formal treaties and agreements. This was the evidence that could expose everything, the proof of the king's treacherous alliance with England. Henri moved quickly to the table and began examining the documents. The first pile contained what appeared to be financial agreements. Detailed breakdowns of payments to be made to English nobles, arrangements for English merchants to receive preferential treatment in French ports, and agreements to manipulate French currency to benefit English trade. The sums involved were staggering, representing enough gold to fund armies or build cities. The second pile was even more damning. These documents outlined the territorial concessions that Henri had heard discussed in the secret meeting. Maps showed the exact boundaries of French lands to be ceded to English control, including strategic ports, fertile agricultural regions, and defensive positions that had been French for centuries. Detailed surveys indicated that the English had been planning this acquisition for years, with French cooperation and assistance. But it was the third pile that truly revealed the scope of the conspiracy. These papers contained correspondence between King Louis and his English counterpart, letters that detailed not just the terms of their secret alliance, but the reasoning behind it. As Henri read by the flickering firelight, a picture emerged of a king so desperate to secure English support for his war with Spain that he was willing to sacrifice French sovereignty itself. The letters revealed that Louis had been losing his conflict with Spain far more badly than the French people knew. His armies were in retreat, his treasury was nearly empty, and Spanish forces were preparing to invade French territory. The secret alliance with England was his last desperate attempt to avoid complete defeat. But the price demanded by the English crown was nothing less than the transformation of France into a client state. One letter in particular made Henri's hands shake with rage. In the king's own handwriting, Louis had agreed not only to the territorial and financial concessions, but to a clause that would allow English advisors to influence French domestic policy. The King of France was agreeing to become a puppet ruler in his own kingdom, with English interests taking precedence over French welfare. As Henri read through document after document, each revelation more shocking than the last, he began to understand the true magnitude of what he had discovered. This was not simply a case of royal corruption or poor judgment. This was the systematic betrayal of an entire nation, orchestrated at the highest levels of government and carried out with meticulous planning over a period of months or even years. But Henri's investigation was interrupted by a sound that made his blood freeze, footsteps approaching the study door. Someone was coming, and there was nowhere to hide in the room that would provide adequate concealment. Henri quickly gathered as many of the most damning documents as he could carry, stuffing them inside his jacket as he looked desperately for an escape route. The footsteps were getting closer, and Henri could now make out the low murmur of voices. At least two people were approaching, and from their casual conversation it was clear they expected to find the room empty. Henri realized that these must be the men tasked with destroying the evidence, arriving to complete the work that had been planned during the midnight conspiracy. With seconds to spare, Henri dove behind the massive oak desk, pressing himself flat against the floor and praying that the shadows would provide enough concealment. The documents crinkled slightly against his chest, and he held his breath, hoping the sound wouldn't give him away.
The study door opened and Henry heard the footsteps of at least 2 men entering the room. From his hiding place he could see their legs and feet as they moved around the room, but their faces remained hidden above his line of sight. "The king wants everything reduced to ash within the hour," came a voice that Henry recognized as belonging to Minister Montclair.
"We cannot afford to leave even the smallest scrap that could be used as evidence against us." "What of the copies that were made for the English?" asked a second voice, one that Henry didn't immediately recognize. "Those are their problem now," responded Montclair. "Our only concern is ensuring that nothing remains on French soil that could implicate His Majesty in these arrangements. If the English are careless with their documents, that reflects poorly on them, not on us." Henry listened in growing horror as the 2 men discussed their plans for the destruction of evidence. They spoke casually about burning documents that represented treaties, agreements, and correspondence that could affect the lives of millions of French citizens. The casual dismissal of the potential consequences, the complete lack of concern for anything beyond their own immediate survival, revealed the true character of the men who had gained the king's trust. "Begin with the territorial agreements," instructed Montclair. "Those are the most dangerous to us. If the people discovered that we had agreed to cede Normandy and Brittany to English control, there would be riots in the streets within hours." Henry watched as feet moved back and forth across his field of vision, carrying documents from the side table to the fireplace. The sound of paper being fed to the flames was like a death knell for any hope of exposing the conspiracy through official channels. With each document that burned, the chances of bringing the truth to light grew smaller. But as Henri lay hidden behind the desk, listening to the destruction of evidence and the casual discussion of treason, his mind was working furiously. The documents he had managed to steal were safely hidden inside his jacket, but they represented only a fraction of the total evidence. More importantly, even if he managed to escape with what he had taken, what could he do with the information? The normal channels for reporting misconduct were completely compromised. Minister Montclair was one of the king's most trusted advisors, and the king himself was the primary architect of the conspiracy. The palace guard command structure reported ultimately to the same people who were orchestrating the cover-up. Even the French parliament would be powerless to act against the king without overwhelming evidence, and much of that evidence was currently being fed to the flames just feet from Henri's hiding place. "What of Captain Dubois?" came the unfamiliar voice suddenly, and Henri's heart nearly stopped beating. "His patrol schedule brought him through this area during our meeting. If he heard anything, Henri is a good soldier, who follows orders and doesn't ask unnecessary questions," responded Montclair. "He has no political interests and no connections outside the palace. Even if he did overhear something, he wouldn't know what to do with the information." "Nevertheless," continued the other man, "perhaps it would be wise to reassign him to duties that keep him away from sensitive areas. A transfer to the outer grounds, or perhaps to one of the auxiliary buildings." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. They were discussing his future as casually as they had discussed burning the documents. While they apparently didn't suspect that he had actually overheard their conspiracy, they were still prepared to upend his life and career as a precautionary measure. "I'll speak with the guard commander tomorrow," agreed Montclair. "We can arrange for Henri to be given new responsibilities that keep him occupied in less critical areas of the palace. It's always better to be overly cautious in situations like this." The casual way in which they discussed manipulating his career and destroying his livelihood added a personal dimension to Henri's anger that made his desire for revenge even more intense. These men were not only betraying France, they were prepared to destroy anyone who might potentially pose a threat to their plans, no matter how innocent or loyal that person might be. As the 2 conspirators continued their work of destroying evidence and planning cover-ups, Henri began to formulate a new strategy. If the normal channels for exposing corruption were compromised, he would have to find alternative means of bringing the truth to light. The documents hidden in his jacket were valuable, but they would be meaningless without a way to get them to people who could act on the information they contained. Henry's mind turned to the network of contacts he had developed over his 15 years of service. Palace guards, by the nature of their work, came into contact with people from every level of society. Merchants, nobles, foreign diplomats, church officials, military commanders. All of these people passed through Versailles regularly, and many of them had developed friendly relationships with the guards who protected them during their visits. More specifically, Henri began to think about Captain Jacques Moreau, a military officer who had served with distinction in several campaigns and who maintained a reputation for absolute integrity. Moreau had visited the palace regularly over the years to consult with military advisors, and he had always treated the palace guards with respect and courtesy. More importantly, Moreau had connections throughout the French military establishment, and a reputation that would lend credibility to any accusations he chose to make. But contacting Moreau would require Henri to leave the palace grounds, something that would normally require permission, and would certainly be noticed by his superiors.
If Montclair and his co-conspirators were already planning to reassign Henri to prevent any potential problems, his movements would likely be monitored even more closely than usual. Henri's planning was interrupted by the sound of the two men completing their work of destruction.
The last of the documents had been fed to the flames, and the fire was now burning brightly with the energy provided by the treasonous papers. "That's the last of them," announced Montclair with satisfaction. "By morning there will be nothing left but ash and memory. And memory can be a very unreliable thing, especially when those who possess it understand the consequences of sharing it inappropriately." The thinly veiled threat was not lost on Henry. Even if someone had overheard or witnessed part of their conspiracy, the destruction of physical evidence would make any accusations impossible to prove.
It would be one person's word against that of the king and his most trusted advisors, a battle that no rational person would expect to win.
"What of our next steps?" asked the second man as they prepared to leave the study.
"We proceed as planned," responded Montclair. "The king will announce new trade policies that favor English merchants, but they will be presented as part of a broader economic strategy. The territorial adjustments will be introduced gradually, described as necessary defensive measures or administrative reorganizations. By the time anyone realizes the full scope of what has been agreed to, it will be too late to reverse."
Henry listened to this final exchange with a mixture of disgust and determination. The casual way in which these men planned to deceive the French people, to gradually implement policies that would ultimately reduce France to a satellite of England, represented everything that Henri had spent his life opposing. The oath he had taken as a palace guard had been to protect France and its people, not to enable their betrayal by corrupt officials. As the footsteps of the two conspirators faded into the distance, Henri remained hidden behind the desk for several more minutes, ensuring that they were truly gone before attempting to move. When he finally emerged from his hiding place, the study bore no traces of the momentous events that had taken place there. The side table was empty, the fireplace contained nothing but ordinary ash, and the room appeared exactly as it had during countless previous visits by Henri during his regular patrol rounds. But Henry knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially in a place like Versailles where deception and manipulation were refined arts practiced by masters. The documents hidden in his jacket represented proof of treachery that went to the very heart of the French government, but that proof would be meaningless unless he could find a way to act on it. As Henri made his way back through the hidden passages toward the servants' quarters, his mind was already working on the next phase of his plan. The men who had betrayed France thought they had destroyed all evidence of their crimes, and they believed that anyone who might have witnessed their conspiracy would be too frightened or too powerless to take action against them.
They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. Henry Dubois had spent 15 years learning every detail of how power operated within the palace walls.
He understood the relationships, the dependencies, and the vulnerabilities that existed among even the most powerful people in France. Most importantly, he had developed the patience, the cunning, and the determination necessary to survive and thrive in an environment where a single mistake could mean death.
Now, with the future of his country hanging in the balance, Henri was prepared to use every skill he had acquired and every contact he had cultivated in service of a cause greater than his own survival. The men who thought they had outwitted him were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. The guard who had been dismissed as a loyal servant following orders was about to become something far more threatening. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The next few hours would determine whether France would slide quietly into becoming an English puppet state, or whether the courage of one ordinary guard would be enough to expose the greatest conspiracy in the nation's history. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Henri Dubois prepared to step out of the shadows and into a battle that would define not only his own fate, but the destiny of millions of his countrymen. The palace that had been his home for 15 years was about to become a battlefield, and Henri intended to make sure he wasn't the only casualty. Dawn arrived at Versailles with deceptive beauty, its golden light streaming through the palace windows and casting long shadows across the marble floors that Henri had walked throughout the night. But beneath the serene surface of morning routine, forces were already in motion that would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy before the sun reached its zenith. Henri had used the remaining hours before daybreak to carefully copy the most damaging documents he had stolen, working by candlelight in his small quarters, with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him such an effective guard. The originals were too precious to risk, but copies would allow him to share the information while maintaining the security of his primary evidence. His hands had cramped from the hours of careful writing, but each word he transcribed was another nail in the coffin of the conspiracy he had uncovered. The challenge now was getting the information to people who could act on it without alerting the conspirators to what he had discovered. Henri's plan was ambitious and dangerous, But 15 years of palace service had taught him that the most audacious strategies were often the most successful, precisely because they were the least expected. His first target was Captain Jacques Moreau, the military officer whose integrity and connections could provide the credibility needed to bring the conspiracy to light. But contacting Moreau directly would require Henri to leave the palace grounds, something that would certainly be noticed and potentially investigated. Instead, Henri would have to rely on the network of messengers, servants, and suppliers who moved constantly between the palace and the outside world. Marie Blanchard had been delivering bread to the palace kitchens for over a decade, and her daily route took her through several neighborhoods of Versailles where military officers maintained their residences. More importantly, Marie had always been friendly to the palace guards, often sharing gossip and news from the town during her deliveries. Henri had helped her on several occasions when delivery schedules conflicted with security procedures, and he believed she could be trusted with a message that could save France. Henri intercepted Marie as she completed her morning delivery, pulling her aside in the service courtyard where their conversation would not be overheard by other palace staff. "Marie," he said urgently, pressing a sealed letter into her hands, "I need you to deliver this message to Captain Moreau at the military quarters. It's a matter of national importance, and time is critical." Marie's eyes widened at the seriousness in Henri's voice. She had known him for years as a calm, steady presence who never became excited or dramatic about anything. The obvious urgency of his request told her that something extraordinary was happening. "Captain Moreau specifically?" she asked, looking down at the sealed letter. "Henri, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept all night." "I can't explain everything now," Henri replied, glancing around to ensure they remained unobserved. "But that letter contains information that could prevent a terrible betrayal of France. Captain Moreau is one of the few men in a position to act on what I've discovered, and he's one of the fewer still who can be trusted completely." Marie studied Henri's face for a moment, seeing something there that convinced her of the gravity of the situation. She tucked the letter securely into her apron and nodded gravely. "I'll deliver it personally," she promised. "Should I wait for a response?" "Tell the captain that time is critical," Henri instructed. "If he wants to meet with me, it should be tonight at the old chapel ruins outside the town walls. I'll be there at midnight, but I may not be able to wait long. And Marie, if anyone asks about this conversation, tell them we were discussing a problem with your delivery schedule, nothing more." As Marie hurried away with her precious cargo, Henri felt the first stirring of hope since the nightmare had begun. But his plan required more than just military intervention. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of government, and exposing it would require allies in multiple spheres of influence. Henri's second message was directed to Father Benedict Arnaud, the priest who served as confessor to many of the palace's noble families. Father Arnaud was known throughout Versailles for his wisdom, his discretion, and his unwavering commitment to moral principles. More importantly, he maintained correspondence with church officials throughout France and even in Rome. If the evidence of the king's betrayal could reach the right ecclesiastical authorities, it might provide another avenue for bringing the conspiracy to light. The challenge with contacting Father Arnaud was that the priest rarely left the palace grounds, spending most of his time in the chapel or in private meetings with noble families. Henri would have to find a way to approach him directly without arousing suspicion from the additional guards who had been posted throughout the palace. Henri's opportunity came during the morning service, when Father Arnaud was conducting Mass in the palace chapel. The congregation consisted primarily of servants and minor nobles, with a few higher-ranking officials attending to maintain appearances of piety. Henri slipped into the back of the chapel during the service, waiting for the moment when he could approach the priest without being observed by others. After the service concluded and the congregation began to disperse, Henri made his way to the front of the chapel where Father Arnaud was securing the ceremonial items used during Mass. The priest looked up as Henri approached, and immediately noticed the strain and exhaustion written across the guard's features. "Captain Dubois," said Father Arnaud quietly, "you look like a man carrying a great burden. Perhaps confession would provide some relief for your troubled spirit." Henri realized that the priest was offering him the perfect opportunity to share his information under the protection of the confessional seal. Even if their conversation was overheard, the sacred nature of confession would prevent anyone from acting on what they learned. "Father, I would be grateful for your counsel," Henri replied, following the priest into the small confessional booth that provided privacy for their conversation. Once they were seated and the privacy of confession was established, Henri wasted no time in revealing what he had discovered. He described the midnight meeting he had overheard, the documents he had seen and copied, and the full scope of the conspiracy that threatened to reduce France to an English client state. Father Arnaud listened in growing horror as the details unfolded, his face growing pale as he realized the implications of what Henri was revealing.
"My son," whispered Father Arnaud when Henri had finished his account, "what you describe is not just treason against the crown, but a betrayal of the sacred trust between a ruler and his people. If what you say is true, then King Louis has violated every principle of Christian kingship and moral governance."
Henri pulled out one of the copied documents and handed it to the priest. "This is a copy of the territorial agreement, Father. You can see for yourself the extent of what has been promised to the English crown." Father Arnaud studied the document by the dim light filtering into the confessional, and Henri could see his hands trembling as he read the terms of the secret treaty. The priest's face grew ashen as he absorbed the full implications of what the king had agreed to. "Dear God," murmured Father Arnaud, "the ports of Normandy, the agricultural regions of Brittany, even strategic defensive positions, Louis has agreed to hand over the very heart of France to our traditional enemies." "Father," said Henry urgently, "you have contacts throughout the church hierarchy. If this information could reach officials in Rome or even bishops within France who maintain independence from royal influence, the church has a moral obligation to oppose such betrayal," agreed Father Arnaud, carefully folding the document and securing it within his robes.
"I will send word immediately to Bishop Rousseau in Lyon. He maintains correspondence with Rome and has never been swayed by political pressure from the crown. But Henri, you must understand the danger you face.
If King Louis and his conspirators discover that you have this information, they already suspect something," Henri replied grimly. "I overheard them planning to transfer me to duties that would keep me away from sensitive areas of the palace."
It's only a matter of time before they realize that documents are missing from what they thought they had completely destroyed. Father Arnaud gripped Henri's arm with surprising strength.
"Then you must be prepared to flee if necessary. I can provide sanctuary within church grounds, but even that protection has limits when dealing with accusations of treason against the crown."
As Henri left the chapel, he felt that his network of allies was beginning to take shape, but he knew that the most dangerous phase of his plan was still ahead. The military and ecclesiastical authorities might be able to act on the information he had provided, but the conspirators would not wait passively for their enemies to organize against them.
Henri's activities would soon be noticed, and when that happened, his life would be measured in hours rather than days. Henri's suspicions proved to be well-founded. When he reported for his regular afternoon duties and found himself summoned to the office of Guard Commander Valerius, a stern military veteran who had served the palace for over 20 years.
Commander Valerius was known for his absolute loyalty to the crown and his intolerance for any breach of discipline or protocol. "Captain Dubois," said Valerius without preamble as Henri entered the office, "there have been some changes to your assignment that will take effect immediately." Henri maintained his composure, though inwardly he was preparing for the conversation he had been dreading.
"What changes, sir?" "You are being transferred to oversight of the outer gardens and grounds," announced Valerius, consulting a document on his desk. "Your new responsibilities will include coordination with the groundskeeping staff, security for public areas during visiting hours, and maintenance of the perimeter patrol routes.
You will no longer have access to the interior palace areas during your regular duties." The transfer was exactly what Henri had expected, but hearing it officially confirmed still sent a chill through him.
His access to information about palace activities would be severely limited, and more importantly, his movements would be much easier to monitor in the open spaces of the gardens and grounds. "May I ask the reason for this reassignment, sir?" Henri asked carefully.
Commander Valerius looked up from his paperwork with an expression that suggested the question was unwelcome. "The decision comes from the highest levels of palace administration.
Your years of faithful service in the interior areas are appreciated, but your skills are now needed in this new capacity. The assignment is effective immediately."
Henri recognized the dismissal in the commander's tone, but as he prepared to leave, Valerius spoke again in a voice that carried an undertone of warning. "Captain Dubois, your new duties will require you to remain within the designated outdoor areas during your shifts.
Any unauthorized presence in interior palace areas will be considered a serious breach of security protocol. So, I trust you understand the implications of such a breach." The threat was clear, even if it was couched in official language.
Henri was being warned that any attempt to continue his investigation or access sensitive areas would result in serious consequences. But even as he acknowledged the order and prepared to begin his new assignment, Henri's mind was working on ways to continue his mission despite the restrictions that had been placed on him.
The transfer to outdoor duties would actually provide Henri with one advantage. It would be much easier for him to meet with contacts outside the palace without his movements being noticed. The guards responsible for the grounds were expected to move freely throughout the exterior areas, and the boundaries between palace property and the surrounding town were less clearly defined than the interior security zones. As Henry began his new patrol route through the palace gardens, he used the time to finalize the most dangerous part of his plan. The information he had already shared with Captain Moreau and Father Arnaud might eventually lead to official action against the conspiracy, but Henri knew that such action could take weeks or months to organize. In the meantime, the conspirators would have time to implement their treasonous policies and eliminate any remaining evidence of their crimes. Henri had decided that a more immediate and dramatic revelation was necessary, something that would expose the conspiracy to the French people directly, forcing the conspirators to respond to public outrage rather than behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The plan he had formulated was incredibly dangerous and would almost certainly result in his death if he was caught, but the potential impact made the risk worthwhile. The key to Henri's plan lay in the weekly public audiences that King Louis held in the Great Hall of the palace. These audiences were formal occasions where the king received petitions from citizens, heard reports from officials, and conducted other ceremonial business in full view of nobles, diplomats, and carefully selected members of the public. The audiences were heavily guarded and meticulously planned, but Henri's knowledge of palace security procedures had revealed a potential vulnerability that he could exploit. Henri spent the remainder of the afternoon using his new patrol duties to scout the routes and timing he would need for his plan to succeed. The evening audience was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock, with the king processing through the Hall of Mirrors before taking his place on the throne in the Great Hall. Henri would have one opportunity to intercept the king during this procession, and if he failed, he would not live to make a second attempt. As the sun began to set over Versailles, Henri made his final preparations. He secured the most damning of the stolen documents inside his jacket, along with a written statement describing everything he had witnessed during the midnight conspiracy. If he succeeded in his plan, the documents would speak for themselves. If he failed, at least there would be a record of what he had discovered for others to find and act upon. The time for subtle maneuvering and careful planning had passed. Henri Dubois, the loyal palace guard who had served faithfully for 15 years, was about to stake everything on a single moment that would either expose the greatest conspiracy in French history or cost him his life in the attempt. As the bells of Versailles chimed 6:30, Henri took his position along the route that the king would follow to the Great Hall. The next 30 minutes would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the nation he had sworn to protect. The conspiracy that had been hatched in midnight shadows was about to be dragged into the blazing light of public scrutiny, and the men who thought they had destroyed all evidence of their crimes were about to discover that the most dangerous witness had been standing guard outside their door all along. The palace around him was filled with the usual bustle of preparation for a royal audience, but Henri knew that within minutes the carefully orchestrated routine would explode into chaos that would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. The guard, who had been dismissed as a simple loyal servant, was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is the courage of a single individual who refuses to remain silent in the face of betrayal. As the sound of approaching footsteps announced the beginning of the royal procession, Henri Dubois stepped forward to meet his destiny, and in doing so, changed the course of French history forever.